It was a quiet afternoon in a small town just outside the city. The streets were calm, the kind of place where people usually waved at each other and nothing big ever happened. The sky had that soft golden light that comes just before sunset, and the sound of leaves brushing against the pavement filled the air. A teenager walked along the sidewalk, a pair of earphones in his ears, a small backpack hanging from one shoulder. He had just finished school and was planning to meet a friend a few blocks away before heading home for dinner. He wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the walk, lost in his music. He looked like any other kid you'd see in that neighborhood, quiet, polite, and focused on his own world. But sometimes even the most ordinary moments can change in ways no one expects. A police car drove slowly down the same street. Inside, two officers were talking about a report that had come through their radio, something about a person suspected of checking parked cars in the area. The description was vague. A young male, dark clothing, possibly carrying a backpack. It wasn't much to go on, but to those officers, that seemed enough. They saw the teenager walking and exchanged a quick glance. The car slowed down, and they decided to take a closer look. The boy didn't even notice them at first. He was halfway through a song he liked, tapping lightly on his thigh to the beat. Then he felt that feeling people sometimes get, like someone is watching them. When he turned around, he saw the patrol car rolling behind him, moving slowly, the lights still off but the presence heavy. He paused, unsure if he should keep walking or stop. One of the officers rolled down the window and called out, "Hey you, come here for a second." The teen took one earbud out and turned, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The officer got out of the car, hand resting on his belt. "We just need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone already serious. The boy nodded slightly. "Okay," he said, though he didn't understand why they were stopping him. "Where are you headed?" one officer asked. "Just going to my friend's house," he replied. "Which friend?" "He lives a few streets over," the boy said. "Can I ask what this is about?" But instead of answering, the second officer stepped closer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said. "Take your hands out of your pockets." The boy froze. "My phone's in there," he said softly. "Just take them out," the officer repeated, louder this time. He did as they asked, slowly raising his hands to show he wasn't hiding anything. His phone hung from one of his fingers, still playing faint music through the earbud dangling from it. "What's in the bag?" one of them asked.
"Just books and my notebook," he said.
"Can I open it?" The officer didn't answer. He just took a step closer. The air around them started to feel tense. A couple of people on the street slowed down, watching quietly from a distance. The boy shifted his weight nervously. "I didn't do anything," he said again. One of the officers looked at him sharply. "You mind if we check?" he asked. Though his tone didn't sound like a real question, the teen hesitated, unsure what to say. He had learned from his mother to always be respectful when talking to police, but he could feel something wrong in the way they were looking at him, like they had already made up their minds. "Can I call my mom first?" he asked. The first officer frowned. "Why do you need to call your mom?" "Because I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "And I want her to know where I am." That didn't sit well. The officer reached toward the bag. "Put that phone down," he said. The boy's hand shook slightly as he lowered it, but he still managed to dial his mother's number. The phone started to ring, but before the call could connect, one of the officers reached out and knocked it out of his hand. It hit the ground, screen facing up, the ringtone echoing faintly from the pavement. The sound made everyone nearby stop for a moment. The teen's heart started pounding. "Hey, why'd you do that?" he said, stepping back. "Calm down," the officer said quickly, though his tone carried no calmness at all. "We told you to listen." The boy looked around. A few more people had stopped walking. Someone across the street had taken out their phone and started recording quietly. "Please," the boy said, voice trembling slightly. "I didn't do anything. I just came from school." "Then you got nothing to worry about," the second officer said, his hand still resting near his belt. "Now turn around." At that moment, the boy's fear turned real. He didn't know what to do. If he said no, they might think he was resisting. If he said yes, he'd be treated like a criminal in front of strangers. His phone was still on the ground, screen flashing with his mother's name. She was calling back again and again, not knowing what was happening on the other end. The boy glanced at it, hoping one of the officers would pick it up. They didn't. "Put your hands on your head," one of them ordered. The boy's breathing got faster. "I didn't do anything," he said again, barely holding back tears. "Stop moving," the officer snapped. The boy froze. "You're acting nervous," the other said. "You got something to hide?" "No," he said. "I'm scared." His voice cracked, and that was the moment one of the bystanders spoke up. "Hey, he's just a kid," someone yelled from across the street. "He didn't do anything." The officers turned slightly, annoyed by the crowd forming. "Back up," one of them barked. But more people had started filming now. The air was filled with tension. The boy stood there, hands shaking, eyes darting between the officers and the people watching. His phone kept buzzing. The officers ignored it, too focused on him. "We're detaining you until we get this sorted," one said. "You can explain later." The boy's heart sank. "Can I please just call my mom?" he whispered. "She'll explain everything." "You can talk later," the officer said again. Suddenly, the radio on one of their shoulders crackled with a message from dispatch, something about checking the description again. But they didn't seem to hear it clearly. The boy looked down at his phone again. The screen was still lit, showing one missed call after another. His mom must have been calling nonstop now, probably wondering why he hadn't picked up. He wanted to tell her what was happening. He wanted to tell her not to worry. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stood there, the fear rising with every second. People around him started murmuring things like, "This doesn't look right," and "Why are they treating him like that?" The officers exchanged a look. They knew people were watching, but pride kept them from stepping back. They kept going, their voices firm but uneasy. "Sit down," one said. The boy hesitated again, his knees weak. He crouched slowly on the curb, staring down at his phone lying a few feet away. He could still see his mother's name flash again. The ringing stopped, then started again. She wasn't giving up. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped she would figure out where he was. She always did. Time felt slower now. Every sound, every footstep, every breath felt heavy. The sun had dipped lower and shadows stretched across the sidewalk. The boy sat there, eyes wet but quiet, trying to hold himself together. He remembered what his mother always told him: stay calm, never argue, always show respect. But even doing everything right didn't seem to help. Just then the radio crackled again, this time clearer. "All units, be advised. The suspect has been located near the old shopping center. Repeat, suspect located elsewhere." The two officers froze. The words hung in the air. The boy lifted his head slightly, his lips trembling but saying nothing. The officer holding the notepad looked uneasy, glancing between the radio and the teen sitting on the curb. It was clear they had made a mistake. But no one moved. No one apologized. They just stood there for a few seconds that felt far too long. The boy's phone rang again, this time louder, breaking the silence. One of the officers picked it up off the ground and glanced at the screen. "Mom," it read. He pressed the answer button. "Hello?" A sharp, controlled voice said from the other end. "Who is this?" "Where's my son?" The officer hesitated, unsure what to say. His partner shifted uncomfortably. The woman's voice on the phone grew firmer. "You have 5 seconds to tell me what's going on before I come there myself." The officer frowned slightly. "Ma'am, who are you?" he asked. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "I'm his mother," she said. "And I'm a special agent with the FBI." Before the officer could respond, the line went silent for a moment. Then a single sentence came through, calm but strong. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." The street stayed quiet after the call ended. The two officers exchanged a nervous look, though they tried not to show it. The boy sat on the curb, staring down at his hands. His phone was back in the officer's grip, and for a moment all he could think about was his mother's voice. The way she sounded, calm, firm, but with that edge that always meant she wasn't joking. He knew she was already on her way, and that gave him a tiny bit of comfort. Still, his heart wouldn't stop racing. A few of the bystanders stayed nearby, watching. Someone whispered, "She said she's FBI?" The word spread quickly among the small group, though no one dared to step closer. The officers were now quieter, less confident than before. They avoided eye contact with each other and with the people filming. "All right," one finally said, trying to sound in control. "We're just going to wait here." The other nodded but didn't reply. They hadn't expected things to take this turn. The last few minutes had changed everything. The boy shifted a little, glancing at the road every few seconds. He didn't know how long it would take his mother to arrive, but he knew she wouldn't waste a single second. She was the kind of person who always got there right when you needed her. He remembered how she used to tell him stories about her work, not the dangerous parts but the lessons. How to read people, how to stay calm under pressure, how to always tell the truth even when it was hard. He had no idea that those lessons would come back to help him in a moment like this. Minutes passed, but it felt longer. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving an orange glow over the quiet street. The officer holding the radio pretended to check it again, though there was nothing new. They hadn't said much since the call, and the silence made the tension even heavier. The boy's hands were shaking, so he rubbed them together, trying to hide it. Then in the distance, he saw a black SUV turning the corner. It moved quickly but didn't have any sirens or flashing lights. It came to a stop just behind the police car, and before anyone could react, the driver's door opened. A tall woman stepped out wearing plain clothes but carrying an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. She didn't rush, but every step she took was confident. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the scene in seconds. The officers froze. They could tell right away she wasn't an ordinary parent. She stopped in front of them and said, "Who's in charge here?" Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The younger officer swallowed hard and said, "Ma'am, this is just a routine stop." "We were routine?" she interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "You stopped my son because he was walking home?" The boy stood slowly, eyes wide, relief flooding his face. "Mom," he started, but she raised her hand gently, telling him to stay back. She wanted answers first. The older officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we received a report about a possible suspect in the area. Your son matched the description." "Matched the description," she repeated slowly. "And what exactly was the description?" The officer hesitated. "A young male, dark clothing, carrying a backpack." She stared at him for a long moment, and he looked away. "That's not a description," she said firmly. "That's a stereotype. You could have stopped half the kids in this town with that." The crowd nearby had grown a little larger now. A few people whispered to each other, phones still out recording every second. The woman glanced around at the bystanders, then turned back to the officers. "Did he resist?" she asked. "No, ma'am," the officer said quickly. "Did he threaten you?" "No." "So you drew attention to him, called for backup, and knocked his phone to the ground while he was trying to call me. That sound right?" The younger officer looked at his shoes. "We didn't mean," she cut him off again. "You didn't mean?" "Then tell me what you did mean." "Officer." Her voice wasn't angry, just controlled, professional, the kind of tone that made people realize they were in trouble. The officer opened his mouth but couldn't find words. The other one shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the older one said, "Ma'am, we just followed procedure. We were doing our job." Her eyes narrowed. "You were doing your job?" She repeated. "Your job is to protect, not to target, not to assume, not to treat a child like a suspect because of how he looks." The words hit hard. The silence that followed felt like the whole street was holding its breath. She took a step closer, lowering her voice slightly. "Do you know how many times I've seen cases like this from the other side of the table? I've spent years investigating misconduct, false arrests, people who didn't get a second chance. And now I find my own son in the same situation, by the same people who should know better." The officers looked stunned. One of them finally said, "We didn't know who he was." "That's the point," she said. "You shouldn't have to know who he is to treat him with respect." Her son stood quietly a few steps away, watching. For the first time since the whole thing began, he felt like he could breathe again. He wasn't just relieved, he was proud. The way his mother handled herself, the way she stood tall even when everyone was watching. It reminded him why he'd always looked up to her. She turned toward him, her expression softening. "Are you okay?" she asked. He nodded, though his voice shook a little when he said, "Yeah." "Did they touch you?" she asked quietly. "No, they just—" He paused. "They scared me." She gave a slow nod, her jaw tightening. Then she turned back to the officers. "I want both your badge numbers," she said calmly. "Ma'am," one of them started, but she interrupted again. "Badge numbers now." They hesitated for a second before reaching for their badges. She took out her phone, snapped clear photos, and then said, "I'll be following up with your department." "Don't think this ends here." The supervising sergeant arrived a minute later, alerted by radio chatter about the incident. When he stepped out of his car and saw her badge, his expression changed immediately. Agent, he said, straightening. I didn't realize. She turned to him, cutting off the apology that was about to come. You didn't realize because you didn't ask. Your officers detained a minor without cause. I expect this handled properly. Yes, ma'am, he said quickly, nodding. We'll take care of it. You will, she replied. Because I'll be making sure of it. The sergeant nodded again, his tone respectful. Then he looked at the officers and said quietly, You're both dismissed. I'll speak with you later. The two officers walked back to their car, their faces red. The crowd started to disperse slowly, though some people stayed back, still whispering about what they'd just witnessed. The boy walked toward his mother and she reached out to put a hand on his shoulder. You okay to go home? She asked softly. He nodded again. Yeah, can we just go? She gave a small smile. Yeah, let's go. They walked back to her car together. The road was quiet again, just like it had been before any of it happened. But something in him felt different. He kept replaying everything in his head, the looks, the fear, the way it all changed the second she showed up. As they got into the car, his mother glanced over at him. You did the right thing, she said gently. You stayed calm. He looked down at his hands. I tried, he said. But they didn't even listen, she sighed. I know, and that's the part that hurts the most. You did everything right. But sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough. He stared out the window as the car started to move. The streetlights were coming on one by one, painting soft yellow circles across the road. For the first time, he realized how easily things could have gone differently. How one misunderstanding, one wrong move could have changed everything. His mother reached over and gave his shoulder a small squeeze. You don't have to be afraid, she said quietly. Not when you've done nothing wrong. He nodded, though deep down he knew it wasn't that simple. Still, having her beside him made him feel safe again. When they reached home, she parked the car and sat there for a moment before turning off the engine. I'll handle what happened today, she said firmly. But I want you to remember something. No matter what happens, you hold your head high. You don't let anyone make you feel small. He looked at her and said softly, You always know what to say. She smiled faintly. I've had practice. They sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of the day slowly lifting. Then she turned to him and said, Let's go inside. You've had enough excitement for one day. He nodded and followed her out of the car. The porch light flickered on as they walked up the steps. The world outside was still the same, but to him, everything felt different now. He had seen how quickly things could change, and how one person's strength could change it back. Inside, the warmth of home wrapped around them. His mother took his phone and said she'd get the screen fixed in the morning. He sat quietly at the table, finally starting to relax. She placed a hand on his back and whispered, You're safe now. He smiled, tired but grateful. Thanks, Mom, she nodded. Always. The next morning started quietly, almost too quiet. The boy woke up early, though he hadn't slept much. He could still hear the echo of the officers' voices in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, the whole scene replayed. The flashing lights, the looks, the fear. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was something he'd actually lived through. When he walked into the kitchen, his mother was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and her laptop open. She looked calm, but her eyes told another story. There was tiredness in them and something sharper. Determination. Morning? She said softly. Morning, he replied, his voice still groggy. Did you sleep at all? She asked, even though she already knew the answer. He shook his head. Not really, she sighed. Me neither. For a moment, the house was filled with silence. The sound of the refrigerator humming and a clock ticking on the wall were the only noises. Then she turned the laptop around so he could see the screen. I filed the incident report early this morning, she said. Internal Affairs will be reviewing it. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but the seriousness in her tone made him nod. Are they going to get in trouble? He asked quietly. She looked at him, her face softening. There's a process for these things, she said carefully. What matters is that it's on record. What they did wasn't right, and now they'll have to answer for it. He looked down at his hands, unsure how to feel. Part of him wanted them to face consequences. Another part just wanted to forget the whole thing. I just don't want people thinking I did something wrong, he said after a long pause. No one will, she said firmly. You didn't. Her voice carried a strength that gave him a small sense of peace. He trusted her. She always made things right. But even so, something inside him had changed. He didn't feel as safe walking around as he used to. Later that morning, she got a call from the police department's internal review office. They wanted her to come in for a formal statement. She agreed, setting her coffee aside. "You stay home," she said. "I'll handle this." He nodded again, but before she left, she came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did everything right yesterday," she said softly. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." When the door closed behind her, the house felt too big and too quiet. He sat on the couch, turning the events over in his mind. He thought about how quickly things had changed from a peaceful walk to something so frightening. And he thought about his mother, how strong she'd been, how everyone had listened the moment she showed up. He felt proud but also sad. Proud that she was who she was, but sad that her title was the only thing that had protected him. Hours later, his mother sat in a meeting room at the police department. The walls were bare except for a flag and a framed photo of the chief. Across the table sat 2 senior officers and an investigator from internal affairs. They greeted her politely, but their faces showed discomfort. They knew exactly who she was and what this meeting was about. "Agent," one of them began, "we want to apologize for the situation yesterday. It was an unfortunate misunderstanding." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "Your officers detained a minor without cause, mishandled his property, and created unnecessary public alarm. I wouldn't call that a misunderstanding." The man cleared his throat. "You're right," he admitted. "The incident should have been handled differently. The department takes these matters seriously." "Good," she said calmly, "because I take them seriously too." The investigator spoke next, his tone careful. "We've reviewed the footage recorded by bystanders and from the officers' body cameras. It's clear that your son cooperated fully and posed no threat. Then, you know everything you need to know," she said. "We'll be issuing a written apology and retraining both officers," the investigator continued. "But we also hope this doesn't damage the department's relationship with the community." She leaned forward slightly. "If you want to repair that relationship," she said, "start by holding your people accountable. Start by making sure no other parent has to stand on a street corner wondering if their child is going to come home." The room fell quiet. No one argued with her. They couldn't. Everything she said was true. After the meeting ended, she walked out of the building and sat in her car for a long moment before turning the key. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. She'd seen too many stories like this during her career, but living it herself had opened a wound she didn't know existed. When she got home that evening, the house smelled like her son had tried cooking something simple. Eggs, maybe. He looked up as soon as she walked in. "How did it go?" he asked. "They admitted they were wrong," she said, setting down her bag. "They'll be disciplined." He nodded slowly. "Good." Then after a pause, he added, "But that doesn't change what happened." She gave a faint smile. "No, it doesn't. But it's a start." They sat together for a while, eating in silence. After dinner, they went out to the backyard to get some air. The sky was full of stars that night, and the air was cool. She sat on the steps and he sat beside her. "You know," she said quietly, "when I joined the bureau, I thought I'd seen everything, but nothing prepared me for yesterday. Seeing you surrounded like that." She stopped, her voice catching for a moment. "It's something I'll never forget." He looked down at the grass. "I was scared," he said honestly. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I moved too fast, they'd think I was doing something wrong." Her heart broke a little at that. "You shouldn't have to think like that," she said softly. He glanced at her. "But I did, because I've seen it happen to other people. I just never thought it would happen to me." She nodded slowly. "Neither did I." They sat in silence again, the sound of crickets filling the night. Finally, she said, "What matters now is that we use this, that we don't just move on and forget. Maybe we can help someone else by telling the truth about what happened." He looked unsure. "You mean talk about it? Like online?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe through community meetings. People need to hear it from someone who's lived it." He thought about it for a while. "I don't know if I want people to know," he admitted. "It feels embarrassing." She looked at him, her voice soft but steady. "There's nothing embarrassing about surviving something unfair. Speaking out isn't weakness, it's strength." He nodded, though he wasn't sure yet. It was still too fresh, but hearing her say it made something inside him shift. A small spark of courage, the same kind she carried. The next day, news of the incident had already spread across town. Someone's video had gone viral overnight. It wasn't long, just a few minutes, but it showed everything. The officers stopping the boy, the tension, and then his mother arriving. People online were talking about it nonstop. Some were outraged, others were thankful the situation hadn't gone worse. When the boy saw the video, he felt strange. It was him on the screen, but it didn't feel like him. It felt like watching someone else's story, one he wished he could forget. His mother sat beside him, reading the comments quietly. "People are supporting you," she said gently. "Look at this one. That mom is a hero." He smiled a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't feel like a hero," he said. "I just wanted to go home." She looked at him with deep understanding. "I know," she said softly. "And that's exactly why it matters. Because not everyone gets to." That hit him harder than anything else she'd said. He leaned back, letting her words sink in. For the first time, he started to realize the bigger picture. Not just what had happened to him, but what it represented. That evening, they got a call from a local reporter asking if they wanted to share their story. At first, he said no. He didn't want attention. But his mother said something that changed his mind. "If we tell the truth," she said, "maybe next time someone else's son won't have to be afraid." He thought about it all night. The next morning, he told her, "Okay, we can talk to them." When the interview was filmed, it was simple and honest. The boy spoke softly, explaining how he'd felt, how scared he was, and how his mother had stood up for him. His mother spoke too, not with anger but with purpose. She talked about accountability, training, and trust. The video aired a few days later, and people from all over reached out. Neighbors, teachers, even officers from other cities. Some thanked them for speaking up. Some admitted they'd never thought about how something so small could turn so dangerous. By the end of that week, the department announced a new community program focused on communication between officers and youth. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. One night, as they sat together again on the porch, the boy looked at his mother and said, "You really changed things." She smiled softly. "No," she said. "We did." He thought about that, looking up at the stars again. The fear he'd felt that day wasn't gone completely, but it didn't control him anymore. What stayed instead was strength. A quiet strength he'd learned from his mother. One that reminded him that even in the hardest moments, standing up for what's right could still change the world, one truth at a time. The black SUV stopped suddenly, its tires crunching against the edge of the curb. The noise startled everyone standing around. The officers who had surrounded the boy turned to look, their hands still resting near their holsters. The mother stepped out, calm but clearly furious. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She just walked straight toward them, her steps quick and firm, her eyes fixed on her son. Her heart was pounding, but her face stayed steady, showing no fear. The moment she reached the group, the officers moved slightly, unsure what was happening. She stopped just a few feet away, her voice strong but even. "That's my son," she said. "What are you doing to him?" Her tone alone made the officers freeze. The one who had been holding the boy's arm spoke first, trying to sound confident. "Ma'am, please stand back. We're handling a situation here." She didn't move an inch. "No," she replied. "You're not handling anything until you explain why you stopped a 16-year-old boy walking home from school." One of the officers stepped forward, his expression tightening. "He matched a description," he said quickly, her eyebrows raised slightly. "A description?" she repeated. "You mean a young black teenager walking home with a backpack?" "That's the description." He hesitated, then tried to change the subject. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" Without a word, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. The small metal glint caught the sunlight. It was clear enough for everyone to see what it was. The letters on it instantly recognizable. She spoke clearly, each word landing with weight. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said. "And that young man you're holding is my son." The entire scene shifted in a heartbeat. The officers blinked, stunned into silence. One of them immediately loosened his grip on the teen's arm, stepping back as if the ground had suddenly turned hot beneath his feet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the crowd standing nearby grew quiet. The mother turned her attention back to her son. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly. He shook his head, still trying to take in what was happening. One of the officers tried to recover, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, we didn't know." She cut him off. You didn't need to know who his mother was to treat him with respect, she said sharply. You're sworn to protect citizens, not intimidate them. Her words hung heavy in the air. The officer looked down, unsure how to respond. Another tried to step in. We were just responding to a call. She didn't let him finish either. A call about what? She demanded. Because I heard every word over that phone you threw to the ground. He told you he didn't do anything. He told you he was on his way home. And yet here we are. The tone in her voice wasn't loud, but it carried power. The kind that comes from someone who spent years demanding truth in tough rooms. She glanced at the body camera on one of their uniforms. That's on? She asked. The officer nodded quickly. Good, she said. Then it'll show how you treated him for doing absolutely nothing wrong. By now a few more people had gathered. Some had their phones up, recording quietly. The tension that had filled the air earlier had shifted. Now it was embarrassment, unease, and a growing sense that the officers were completely out of their depth. The sergeant arrived a minute later, stepping out of another patrol car. He saw her immediately and recognized the badge still in her hand. His whole posture changed. He walked over quickly, his voice low and apologetic. Agent, I'm sorry for this, he said. There must have been a misunderstanding. She turned to him. A misunderstanding, she repeated slowly. That's one way to put it. But you and I both know what this was. My son didn't match a description, he matched a bias, and that could have cost him his life. The sergeant lowered his eyes. I understand, he said quietly. No, she said, her tone firm but calm. I don't think you do. Because if you did, this wouldn't keep happening. Not in this neighborhood, not in this country. Her son stood close beside her now, still shaken but trying to stay composed. He had never seen his mother this way before, so controlled yet so fierce. He looked around and saw the same officers who had yelled at him just minutes ago now, standing silently, avoiding his eyes. The mother turned to her son again. You okay to talk? She asked. He nodded, still holding his backpack tightly. She turned back to the officers. You're going to explain exactly what led to this stop, she said. And you're going to do it right now. The officer who had initiated the stop tried to find words. There was a report of someone suspicious near a parked car, he said slowly. A caller said the person was wearing dark clothes. When we saw him, we thought, you thought what? She asked sharply. That a kid in a hoodie automatically equals a threat? Did you ask him any questions before ordering him to the ground? The officer stammered. He reached into his pocket, ma'am. We didn't know if he had something. He had a phone, she said coldly. The same phone you threw to the pavement, the crowd murmured. Even the sergeant looked uncomfortable. Agent, we'll be conducting a full review of this incident, he said carefully. I'll make sure you do, she replied. And I'll be requesting a copy of that body cam footage myself. The sergeant nodded quickly, his voice almost respectful now. Of course. For a moment everything was still. The mother looked at her son, then at the officers again. This could have gone a very different way, she said quietly. You don't know how close you came to turning a family's evening into a tragedy, and all because of assumptions. Her voice softened slightly but stayed steady. You owe this young man an apology. The officers glanced at one another, hesitant. Finally, the one who had spoken first stepped forward. I'm sorry, he said awkwardly. We didn't mean to scare you. The teen looked at him but didn't respond. His mother gave a slight nod. You should think about why you did, she said. Fear doesn't start with the person in front of you. It starts with what's already in your mind. The sergeant placed a gentle hand on her arm, his expression tired. Agent, can we talk privately? He asked later, she said. Right now, I'm taking my son home. She turned, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. Together, they walked toward her SUV. The crowd stepped aside, some whispering words of support. One woman called out softly, Good for you. As they reached the car, the boy finally let out a long breath. I thought they were going to arrest me, he said quietly. She looked at him, her voice gentle now. I know, but you did everything right. You stayed calm. You didn't fight back. That's what kept you safe today. He nodded slowly, his eyes still wide. They didn't believe me when I told them I didn't do anything. She sighed, starting the car. I know, and that's what hurts the most. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The sound of the engine filled the silence. As they drove away, the flashing lights from the police cars faded in the rearview mirror. Mom, he said quietly. Would it have been different if you weren't an agent? She didn't answer right away. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Maybe, she said finally. And that's the problem. It shouldn't take a badge for them to see your worth. He looked out the window, his reflection faint against the glass. I hate that it has to be that way. She reached over and gave his hand a squeeze. Me too, she said softly. But as long as I'm here, you'll never face it alone. The drive home felt longer than usual. Both of them sat in silence, lost in thought. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by exhaustion and disbelief. But beneath it all there was also pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that comes from standing your ground with truth on your side. When they finally pulled into their driveway, she parked the car and turned to him. You did nothing wrong, she said again, looking directly at him. Remember that. He nodded, and for the first time since it all began, a small bit of calm returned to his face. Inside the house, she poured herself a glass of water and sat down, her badge still on the table beside her. The events replayed in her head over and over. The flashing lights, the fear in her son's eyes, the look on the officers' faces when they realized who she was. It shouldn't have taken her title to make them listen. It should have taken his words. She looked toward the hallway where her son had gone to his room. You'll be okay, she whispered to herself. But this isn't over. Not for us and not for anyone else who's ever been in your place. Outside, the street had gone quiet again, but something had changed. The people who had watched would remember what they saw. A mother standing tall, refusing to let her son be treated like anything less than he deserved. And deep down, even the officers would remember. Because that kind of confrontation doesn't fade. It leaves a mark. One that might make them think twice the next time they see a boy walking home with a backpack, just trying to live his life. The next morning, the house was quiet. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, landing across the kitchen table where the mother sat with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene from the night before came back. Her son standing on the sidewalk, his hands trembling, the police shouting, her badge flashing in the evening light. Upstairs, her son was still asleep. He'd stayed up late too, not because he couldn't rest, but because his mind wouldn't stop replaying what happened. He kept hearing their voices telling him to get on the ground. The sound of his phone hitting the pavement. The fear that had crawled up his throat and wouldn't go away. Downstairs, his mother took a deep breath and opened her laptop. She began typing her official report, not just as a mother, but as an agent. It was difficult to separate the two, but she had to. She knew there had to be a record of what happened. She didn't want this to become another story whispered about and forgotten. As she wrote, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from anger mixed with exhaustion. She paused for a moment, thinking about how close everything had come to disaster. If she hadn't answered that phone, if she hadn't arrived when she did, her son's life might have changed forever, or worse, ended before it even truly began. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered quietly to herself, "He's safe. That's what matters." But deep down, she knew safety shouldn't depend on luck or her job title. It should be something every mother could count on for her child. When her son finally came downstairs, he looked tired but calmer. She smiled gently. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied softly, sliding into the chair across from her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The air felt heavy, full of things neither knew how to say. He finally asked, "Are they in trouble now?" She looked at him carefully. "There's going to be an investigation," she said. "Their department already called me this morning. They'll review the footage and talk to the officers involved." He nodded slowly. "Do you think anything will change?" Her eyes softened. "I hope so," she said. "But I've learned that real change takes time, and people who don't give up." He looked down at his hands. "I just don't get it," he said quietly. "I was just walking. I wasn't doing anything." "I know," she said gently. "You did everything right. Sometimes people see what they expect to see, not what's really in front of them." He nodded, though he didn't seem satisfied. He wanted a reason that made sense, but there wasn't one. Later that day, she took him with her to the station. She didn't have to. But she wanted him to see that standing up for himself wasn't something to be ashamed of. When they walked in, the same sergeant from the night before met them at the front desk. He looked tired, too, as if the weight of what happened had followed him home as well. "Agent," he said respectfully, "thank you for coming in. She gave a polite nod. "I'm here to give my statement," she said. The sergeant looked at the boy. "You don't have to be here for this part," he said kindly. The boy shook his head. "I want to be," he said quietly. The mother gave him a small smile. "He's staying," she said. They sat in a small interview room and she told them everything. How the stop started, what she heard on the phone, what she saw when she arrived. She spoke calmly, never raising her voice, but every word carried weight. The officers taking notes could feel it. After she finished, there was a moment of silence. The sergeant finally said, "We'll handle this properly, Agent, I promise." "I'm not looking for revenge," she said softly. "I'm looking for accountability. And maybe, just maybe, some understanding." He nodded. "I understand." When they left the station, the boy looked up at his mother. "Do you think they'll really learn from this?" She sighed. "I want to believe they will. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people can't forget what they saw." That evening, a local news report mentioned the incident briefly. No names, just the facts. People online started sharing the video that had been recorded by bystanders. The clip showed everything. The officer stopping the teen, his frightened voice saying he hadn't done anything, and then his mother arriving, badge in hand, calm but unshakable. The comments under the video filled quickly. Some people were angry, some thankful, some heartbroken. A few said the officers should lose their jobs. Others said this was proof of a bigger problem. But one comment stood out. It simply said, "I wish every mother had her power and her courage." The mother didn't read most of the comments. She wasn't interested in attention. What mattered to her was that people were seeing the truth. Not a story told secondhand, but something real that showed how quickly judgment can turn into danger. Over the next few days, her son became quieter. At school, his friends asked him questions, wanting to know every detail. Some of them said things like, "Man, you're lucky your mom's FBI." He just nodded, though the word lucky didn't feel right to him. At night, he lay awake thinking about that word. Lucky shouldn't be what you needed to survive. One evening, as his mother worked late in her home office, he knocked softly on her door. She looked up from her computer and smiled. "Hey," she said. "Can't sleep?" He shook his head. "I was just thinking about everything." She gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "When they stopped me, I felt like no matter what I said, they weren't going to believe me. It's like my words didn't matter." Her chest tightened. She reached over and placed her hand over his. "Your words always matter," she said. "Even when people don't listen, you keep speaking your truth. That's how things change, not right away, but eventually." He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you ever get scared?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "All the time," she said. "But I don't let fear make my decisions. I let it remind me why I have to keep going." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand." They sat in silence for a while. Then he said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Mom." Her throat tightened. "I'm proud of you too," she said softly. "You kept your head. You stayed calm. That's strength." The following week, the police department released a public statement acknowledging the mistake. They promised new training and said the incident was under review. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The mother read the statement and felt a small spark of hope. Maybe the next young boy walking home wouldn't have to go through what her son did. A few months later, she was invited to speak at a local community event about fairness and trust between police and the public. At first, she didn't want to. She didn't like being in the spotlight. But her son encouraged her. "You should," he said. "People listen when you talk," so she went. Standing at the front of a crowded hall, she told the story, not in anger, but in truth. She spoke about her son's fear, the officer's assumptions, and what it meant to be a mother caught between two worlds, enforcing the law, and watching it nearly destroy the person she loved most. She ended her talk with a quiet but powerful message. We can't fix what we won't face. We can't build trust if we don't start with humanity. When she stepped off the stage, people stood and clapped, not just for her words, but for the strength it took to speak them. That night, driving home, her son looked out the window at the passing lights. "You were amazing up there," he said. She smiled. "I just told the truth," he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "But sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the kind of silence that feels peaceful, not heavy. The kind that comes when a storm has finally passed. When they got home, she watched him head upstairs, his steps lighter than before. She knew he would still carry that memory, maybe for the rest of his life. But she also knew he'd carry something else. The lesson that his voice had value, and that courage doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it just means standing your ground with grace. Later, she went outside for a moment, standing on the porch under the quiet night sky. The street was still, the same one where everything had happened. But tonight it looked different, softer somehow. She looked up at the stars, the same stars she used to point out to her son when he was little. "You're safe," she whispered to herself again, "and I'll keep fighting to make sure it stays that way. Not just for you, but for every kid who deserves to walk home without fear." Inside the house, her phone buzzed with a message from her supervisor. "Proud of how you handled things. You did the right thing," she smiled faintly. It wasn't about being right. It was about being human. And as she turned off the porch light and closed the door, she knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something bigger, a reminder that sometimes one act of courage, one moment of truth, can echo far beyond a single night on a quiet street.